History doesn't always hide its monsters in the shadows. Sometimes, it hides them in the records we think we already know. And tonight, we're not revisiting the guillotine. That part, everyone knows. We're stepping into the 76 days of terror that came before the blade. Into the cell where a queen wasn't just punished. She was systematically broken. If you think execution was the end, wait until you learn what they did to her first. The tower wasn't built to torture her. But in those final months it became a machine designed for exactly that purpose. When Marie Antoinette was brought to the temple, she wasn't treated like a monarch stripped of power. She was treated like an idea that needed to be erased. The first thing they took from her was space. Her chamber was small, cold, and damp, a room where the walls seemed to draw closer every night, where the sound of her own breath echoed back at her, as if reminding her of how alone she truly was. The furniture was sparse, not because they lacked resources, but because discomfort was part of the plan. Creaking chairs, a hard wooden bed, and a window so narrow it filtered only enough light to remind her what she was missing. Light became a ration. Silence became a punishment. Every detail of her environment was chosen to wear down the mind long before the body began to fail. Then came the surveillance. 2 guards stationed inside her room at all hours, not to protect her, but to dismantle the last threads of her humanity. There was no privacy, no moment where she could weep, pray, or even think without someone staring. She didn't sleep alone. She didn't dress alone. She wasn't allowed to turn her face toward the wall, without being told to sit properly and remain visible. The act of existing became exhausting. It was a slow suffocation, not of the lungs but of identity. The queen who once commanded courtiers now asked permission to close her eyes. Even her silence was monitored, her breaths counted, her movements corrected like she was a misbehaving child, rather than a condemned queen. But the psychological erosion didn't stop there. Her meals were intentionally plain, almost deliberately tasteless, designed not to nourish but to drain her joy. Food arrived cold, water often stale, her plates clattered down as if to remind her she no longer deserved civility. Every gesture was meant to tell her she was no longer Marie Antoinette. She was prisoner 280, a number that replaced her name. They didn't shout at her. They didn't strike her. They did something worse, they made her feel irrelevant. She, who once defined fashion, language, and culture, was reduced to a silent figure waiting for commands. The emptiness of the room mirrored the emptiness they wanted to create inside her. Isolation became the final tool. Her family, once the lifeline that kept her steady through scandal and political tension, was stripped away from her one by one. The corridors echoed not with footsteps but with absence. Letters never arrived. Voices she once recognized grew distant. The loneliness was crafted with precision. It wasn't the kind that grows naturally from imprisonment, but the kind inflicted through careful calculation. She wasn't merely cut off from the outside world. She was cut off from herself. Day after day, her captors chipped away at the parts of her that made her human, until the tower wasn't just a prison but a psychological crucible. A place where she woke each morning slightly less whole than the night before. They knew exactly where her strength lived, and it wasn't in her crown or her title, or the remnants of her fading political influence. It lived in her children, the only pieces of her former life she still clung to. So when the revolutionaries realized they couldn't break her through confinement alone, they turned to the one weapon guaranteed to pierce deeper than any blade. They took her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, the small boy who once slept pressed against her side, who once clung to her skirts in the hallways of Versailles, who once believed his mother could protect him from anything. They separated them not with violence, but with the quiet, clinical precision of people who understood that tearing a child from a mother isn't an act. It's a wound that keeps widening at first. She tried to stay strong, convincing herself he would be safe somewhere else in the tower. She listened for his footsteps in the corridor, for his laughter or even his cries. But the silence became the message. Days passed without news, then weeks. Guards avoided her eyes when she asked about him, their refusal to speak becoming more brutal than any explicit cruelty. She realized slowly, with growing dread, that the separation wasn't temporary. It was deliberate. It was strategy. Her son wasn't simply removed. He was being reshaped into something unrecognizable. The boy who once played with wooden soldiers was now surrounded by men whose only purpose was to unmake him. They isolated him, manipulated him, whispered poison into his ears. They told him his mother had abandoned him, that she was a traitor, that everything he loved had been built on lies. A child's mind, still soft and searching, became their canvas. They starved him of affection, fed him falsehoods, and kept him awake long enough that his sense of truth began to dissolve. Gradually, they twisted the innocence out of him until he became a tool. A testimony machine designed to echo their accusations. When the interrogators finally presented him with questions about his mother, he was already broken in ways Marie Antoinette could never have imagined. They forced him to confirm charges that were meant to disgrace her. Accusations crafted not for accuracy, but for humiliation. His voice, weak and confused, was used as evidence, twisted into a blade aimed straight at her heart. They brought these statements to her not to seek truth, but to crush her spirit with the knowledge that her child had been turned into a weapon for Marie Antoinette. This was the moment the cell walls truly closed in. She didn't rage or collapse. She simply stared, hollow-eyed, at the words that claimed to come from her son. She knew they weren't his thoughts, but that didn't matter. The damage was already done. The deepest cruelty wasn't that they had taken him away. It was that they had stolen his childhood, his trust, his sense of self. He became a prisoner within a prisoner, a child held hostage inside his own mind. And the knowledge of that, the unbearable realization that her captors had used her greatest love as a weapon, became the most effective psychological blow she ever endured. Every morning in the temple began the same way, not with sunlight slipping through a window, but with the sound of metal, locks turning, boots scraping, keys rattling, as if to remind her that every minute of her existence belonged to someone else now. Routine became the revolution's sharpest blade. They didn't need whips or chains, because the rituals they forced upon her worked far more slowly, far more cruelly, wearing her mind down grain by grain. Her day started with God stepping into her cell before she could rise, their eyes watching her as she dressed, as she moved, as she tried to preserve even a shred of dignity. Privacy, once effortless, became a luxury they used against her. She wasn't granted the courtesy to turn her back, to hide her tears, or to mourn the life she had lost. The room itself mirrored the psychological assault. The walls were damp and cold, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and stale breath. The stone seemed hungry, swallowing every sound she made. Her bed was a slab of discomfort. The mattress thin, the blanket rough enough to scrape her skin, the pillow little more than compacted straw. Sleep became another battlefield. Guards were instructed to keep a constant watch, their lanterns burning through the night, their whispers reminding her that rest was something she would have to earn, something they never intended to let her fully have. Every time she drifted into shallow sleep, the clang of a boot, or the flick of a lantern, would yank her back into consciousness, leaving her mind foggy and fragile. Meals followed the same pattern of calculated cruelty. The food was intentionally bland, often cold by the time it reached her, and served with a deliberate lack of respect. Wooden bowls slammed onto the table, water brought in cloudy cups, bread tough enough to tear at her gums. Not enough to starve her, just enough to weaken her. Not enough to kill her, just enough to erode her strength. She had once been surrounded by court banquets, by sweet pastries and warm soups, by servants who presented dishes like offerings. Now every bite reminded her that the world she knew had been stripped away, replaced with a version designed to extinguish comfort in every form. Even the smallest acts became humiliations. When she tried to stitch her clothes, the needles were taken away. When she reached for a book, they denied her. When she attempted to write, ink and paper were replaced with suspicion. Her captors wanted her mind idle, restless, trapped with no outlet for grief or thought. The tower became a place where the passage of time felt distorted. Hours stretched endlessly, marked not by clocks but by the slow decay of her spirit. The gods learned her rhythms. When she needed silence, they talked. When she craved distraction, they left her alone. When she sought to disappear into a corner, they stepped closer. The worst moments came in the evenings. When the sky darkened and the air grew colder, the tower amplified every emotion she tried to suppress. The sound of other prisoners shuffling in distant corridors, the creaking of the building as it settled, the muffled whispers of gods sharing stories she wasn't allowed to be part of. She sat on her hard wooden chair, hands folded, staring at the single candle that flickered weakly beside her. It was during these hours that the rituals of dehumanization reached their full effect. Not one of the acts seemed violent on its own, but together they formed a relentless rhythm of psychological erosion, stripping her not only of her royal identity, but of her basic sense of being human. The interrogation wasn't meant to reveal truth, it was designed to expose weakness. By the time they summoned her, Marie Antoinette was already worn thin from sleepless nights, cold meals, and the constant pressure of being watched. The men who entered her cell did not bring instruments of pain, because they didn't need them. Their weapons were words, silence, accusations crafted not to gather evidence, but to tear open emotional wounds. She was taken from her chamber into a stark room, where the walls seemed closer, the air staler, the light harsher. A wooden table stood between her and the tribunal, though it felt less like a barrier and more like a stage on which they expected her to break. The questions began softly, almost politely, as though the interrogators wished to pretend they were offering fairness. They asked about her time in Versailles, about the king, about the finances of France. But every question had a hidden blade. Each one carried an implication of guilt. They were not interested in her answers. They were interested in her reactions. They watched her face more closely than her words. They waited for tremors in her voice, for any sign that the pressure was beginning to crack through the composure she tried desperately to maintain. When she attempted to stay calm, they shifted their tone, growing sharper, louder, accusing her of deception, calling her cold, calling her manipulative. Then they turned the conversation to her children, the one topic guaranteed to pierce the mask she tried to hold. They presented her with the statements extracted from her son, twisted and reshaped into accusations that no mother should ever hear. The words were vile, crafted not to reflect truth, but to provoke shame and horror. When she read them, her breath stalled. She stared at the paper, with an expression torn between disbelief and devastation. The interrogators watched her closely, hungry for the moment when the emotional blade finally struck deep. They wanted her grief to become part of her confession. They waited for her to collapse under the weight of something she hadn't done. As she tried to defend herself, they interrupted her repeatedly, twisting her sentences, forcing her into corners where every answer sounded like guilt. If she hesitated, it was proof of hiding something. If she spoke quickly, it was proof of rehearsed lies. The tribunal wasn't a court, it was a theater where the verdict had been written before she even entered the room. They shifted tactics constantly, taunting her, then suddenly softening their voices, giving her false hope that they might listen, only to crush that hope moments later. They wanted emotional exhaustion, the slow unraveling of a mind pushed beyond its limits. The room became suffocating. The air thickened with hostility. The interrogators leaned closer, pressing her with details meant to confuse and overwhelm. They accused her of conspiring, of manipulating, of using her femininity as a weapon. They pushed her into explaining decisions she had no part in, into defending actions she never took, into answering for crimes she couldn't have committed. Each question laid another stone on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder to remember who she had been before this moment. And as the hours dragged on, the purpose of the interrogation became painfully clear. They didn't need her confession. They only needed her broken enough that the execution would feel less like punishment and more like the inevitable end of a woman they believed they had already destroyed. They woke her before dawn, long before the city stirred, long before the sun had the chance to soften the edges of the world. The cell felt colder than usual, as though the stone itself knew what the day would bring. She rose slowly, not because of hesitation, but because her body had become a vessel of exhaustion. The gods watched without expression as she dressed in the simple white gown they provided, a garment chosen not for dignity but for symbolism. White, purity, surrender, the color of someone already erased. The moment she stepped out of her chamber, the echo of her footsteps through the narrow corridor felt like the last trace of who she once was. Every movement she made belonged to a journey that had already been decided for her. When they brought her to the cart, the air outside struck her like a revelation. After months of suffocating stone walls, the sky felt impossibly wide, the light shockingly bright. But the world she stepped into was not the world she once knew. The streets, once filled with courtiers bowing as she passed, were now crowded with faces twisted by anger, curiosity, or something colder. The cart wasn't a carriage, it was a simple wooden platform, rough and unadorned, a stage built to display humiliation rather than royalty. She was forced to sit on a hard plank, her hands bound lightly, not because she posed a threat, but because the symbolism of restraint served the spectacle. The journey to the scaffold stretched longer than the distance itself. The wheels groaned against the cobblestones, moving slow enough that the crowd had time to stare, shout, jeer. Some threw insults, others spit, and some simply watched with blank, unsettling fascination. But what made this moment truly horrifying was not the hatred. It was the way the crowd demanded to see her fear, as if her suffering validated their revolution. Yet she sat upright, her posture rigid not from pride, but from the numbness that had settled inside her. The humiliation of being paraded through the city was part of the punishment, a final piece of psychological torment crafted to ensure that whatever remained of her dignity would be stripped before she reached the blade. As the cart creaked closer to the Place de la Révolution, the noise of the crowd swelled, blending into a single monstrous roar. The scaffold rose ahead of her, stark and mechanical against the morning sky. The guillotine, with its gleaming blade poised above the frame, looked less like an instrument of death, and more like the endpoint of a long series of cruelties. She wasn't afraid of it. What lingered inside her was something heavier. The knowledge that everything truly painful, everything truly scarring, had already happened. The guillotine was simply the final chapter of a story whose deepest agony had been written in the tower. When she stepped down from the cart, the wood beneath her shoes felt unsteady, not because she faltered but because the day carried a surreal weight. The executioner approached her, his voice quiet, offering instructions with a strange formality. The crowd fell into an expectant hush, waiting not for justice but for spectacle. And in that suspended moment between life and death, she understood what her captors had always intended. The blade was not the horror. It was the release. The true cruelty had unfolded in the days and nights before this morning. The sleepless torment, the taken child, the interrogations, the slow unraveling of identity. By the time she reached the scaffold, she wasn't being killed. She had already been undone long before the blade ever touched her neck.